There is a moment, and if you have ever lived it, you know exactly what I am talking about, when a family stops being a family. Not with a bang. Not with one dramatic, final goodbye. It happens quietly. It happens in the spaces between conversations that never happened, in the bedrooms where children cried themselves to sleep wondering what they did wrong, in the kitchen where a mother stood at the sink long after the dishes were done, staring out the window at a driveway that stayed empty far too long. This is not a story about perfect people. This is not a story about a perfect family. This is a story about the kind of love that gets buried under years of silence, under pride, under pain, and somehow, against everything that should have made it impossible, finds its way back to the surface. This is the story of the Harmons. And before this is over, you will understand why some wounds take decades to heal, why some doors stay locked from the inside, and why the moment they finally opened that door again changed everything for every single one of them. My name is not important. What is important is that you stay right here, because what you are about to hear is not something you will forget easily. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning. It was 1987, and the small town of Clarksville, Tennessee was the kind of place where everybody knew your name, your business, and your grandmother's maiden name. It was a town built on church potlucks and Friday night football games, on neighbors leaving casseroles on each other's porches when times got hard. And in that town, on a quiet street lined with oak trees that had been growing since before the Civil War, lived Raymond Harmon and his wife, Diane. Raymond was 29 years old, a mechanic with grease permanently embedded beneath his fingernails and a laugh loud enough to rattle the windows. Diane was 27, a schoolteacher who read to her students in different voices and who once drove 45 minutes in a thunderstorm to bring a sick student's homework to his door because she did not want him to fall behind. They had been married for 5 years. They had 3 children. A daughter named Callie, who was 4 years old and already had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. A son named Marcus, who was 2 and had only recently discovered that he could open the refrigerator by himself, which had become the single greatest achievement of his young life. And a baby, just 8 months old, named Ellie, who smelled like powder and slept with her fists balled up like she was already ready to fight the world. By every measure that the town of Clarksville used to take stock of a person, the Harmons were doing all right. Raymond had steady work. Diane had a job she loved. The children were healthy and loud and full of life. They went to church on Sundays. They had a vegetable garden in the backyard that Diane tended with tremendous patience and Raymond managed to kill every single summer without fail. They argued about money, the way young couples with 3 children always argue about money, but they made it work. They always made it work. Or at least, that is what Diane believed. That is what the children believed, in the unspoken, unexamined way that children believe things about their parents, the way children trust that the ground beneath their feet is solid, that the ceiling above their heads will hold. Raymond believed something different. There are men who carry something inside them that they cannot name, something restless and raw and entirely destructive, and they spend their whole lives either fighting it or surrendering to it. Raymond Harmon was the second kind of man. He had grown up watching his own father disappear into a bottle every night after dinner, had watched his mother pretend not to notice, had told himself 1,000 times that he would never be that man, that he would be different, that love was enough to save a person from becoming what they came from. But the thing about running from who you are is that eventually your legs give out. By the spring of 1989, Raymond had started drinking. Not in the dramatic, obvious way that makes it easy to point to and name. Slowly. The way water seeps into a foundation, quiet and invisible until one day the whole structure shifts. A few beers after work became a 6-pack. A 6-pack became a bottle of whiskey he kept in the glove compartment of his truck. He was still going to work. He was still coming home. But he was coming home somewhere else inside himself, to a place where Diane's voice irritated him and the children's noise made something behind his eyes throb with anger. He never laid a hand on Diane. He never raised a hand to the children. But there are ways of making a house feel dangerous that do not require violence. There is the silence that has teeth in it. There is the way a person's presence in a room can make everyone else hold their breath. There is the way children learn to play quietly, to whisper to each other, to gauge the temperature of their father's mood from the sound of his boots on the porch steps before he even opened the door. Callie learned to read the signs first, the way oldest children always do. By the time she was 6, she could tell from the way her father's truck pulled into the driveway whether it was going to be a good night or a night she needed to take Marcus and Ellie upstairs and put a movie on loud enough to cover whatever happened in the kitchen below. She was 6 years old, and she was already managing her family's grief. Diane prayed. Diane pleaded. Diane found a counselor who specialized in addiction and made Raymond go twice before he stopped going and told her the man was a fool who did not know what he was talking about. She called his mother, which Raymond never forgave her for. She poured bottles down the drain. She cried in the shower so the children would not hear. She loved Raymond with the kind of love that refuses to accept what is right in front of it, the kind of love that keeps rearranging the furniture of a burning house because it cannot bear to walk out the door. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1991, Raymond Harmon walked out the door. Callie was 8. Marcus had just turned 6. Ellie was 3 years old. Raymond did not leave a note. He left a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the kitchen table and his wedding ring on the bathroom counter, and he got in his truck and he drove away from Clarksville, Tennessee, and from the 3 children who would spend the next 3 decades trying to understand what they had done to make their father choose leaving over staying. Diane stood in that bathroom for a long time looking at that ring. She told Marcus years later that she picked it up and held it in her palm and that it felt like nothing. Like a washer from a hardware store. Like something that had no weight at all. She said that was the moment she understood that Raymond had not left suddenly, that Raymond had been leaving for a very long time, and that the ring was just the last thing he put down before he finished going. What happened after that is the part of this story that does not get told enough, the part that the movies skip over because it is not cinematic, because it is not one devastating moment but thousands of small devastating moments strung together across years. What happened after Raymond left is that Diane Harmon got up every single morning and made breakfast for 3 children who needed her. She went to work and stood in front of a classroom and taught other people's children to read and to love learning and to believe that the world was a place full of possibility, and then she came home and paid bills she did not have enough money to pay and helped with homework and gave baths and read bedtime stories and cried, alone, in the dark, after everyone else was asleep. What happened is that Callie started having anxiety attacks at school at age 10. That Marcus got into his first fight at 12 and his third fight at 13 and developed a reputation in Clarksville as a boy who was looking for trouble, which was not accurate but was close enough to the truth to be dangerous. What actually happened is that Marcus was a boy who had learned that the world could take everything from you without warning, and he had decided that if something was going to hurt him, he was going to see it coming. He was a boy who had turned his grief outward because he did not know how to survive it any other way. What happened is that little Ellie, who had been 3 years old when her father left and who had no real memory of him at all, grew up with a ghost. She grew up carrying the shape of something she had never actually held. She would watch other girls with their fathers at school events and feel something she could not name, a kind of hunger that had no object, an ache for something she had never been given and therefore had no language for losing. Diane did not speak badly of Raymond in front of the children. This was the thing that people who knew her always said first when they talked about her, that she could have poisoned those children against their father and she chose not to. She told them that Raymond was sick, that sometimes people are so sick inside themselves that they cannot be what other people need them to be. She told them it was not their fault. She said those exact words more times than she could count. She said it in the car on the way to school and at the dinner table and in quiet moments when she caught one of them staring at the front door. It is not your fault. It is not your fault. It is not your fault. And they heard her. And they believed her in the way that you believe something intellectually while simultaneously feeling the opposite thing in your body, in your chest, in the place where a father's love should have lived and instead left a draft. The years moved the way years do when you are surviving something rather than living something. They moved like something heavy being pushed uphill. Callie graduated high school with honors and got a scholarship to the University of Tennessee. Marcus barely graduated, spent 2 years working construction, and then joined the army at 21, which was the thing that finally gave him structure and purpose and a way to channel the anger that had been living in him like a second heartbeat since he was 6 years old. Ellie grew up the quietest of the three, the one who watched everything and said little, who became an emergency room nurse because she had decided somewhere in adolescence that if she could not prevent loss, she could at least stand in its way. They were not a broken family in the way that phrase is usually used, as if broken means destroyed, as if broken means done. They were a broken family in the way that a bone is broken and heals crooked. They were still a family. They still gathered at Diane's house for Thanksgiving. They still called each other. They still had inside jokes and shared memories and the particular shorthand of people who have survived something together. But there was always the shape of Raymond in the room with them, the empty chair that no one acknowledged, the photograph that Diane had kept for reasons she never fully explained, a picture from their wedding day, the two of them young and laughing in the parking lot of the church, Raymond's arm around her waist, both of them looking at each other rather than the camera. Callie had asked her once why she kept it. Diane had thought about the question for what felt like a very long time before she answered. She said, because he wasn't always what he became. And Callie had taken that answer and turned it over in her mind for years, the way you turn a stone over in your hand, feeling its weight. Meanwhile, Raymond Harmon had disappeared into the country the way people did before the internet made disappearing almost impossible. He had driven from Clarksville to Memphis and from Memphis to Albuquerque, New Mexico, following work and then following nothing in particular, drifting through years the way a leaf drifts on moving water, not steering, just moving. He worked construction. He worked in a warehouse. He worked briefly on a ranch outside of Santa Fe and spent 8 months as a cook in a roadside diner in Texas where the owner was a 60-year-old woman named Pat who told him he was the saddest-looking person she had ever seen and made him eat a proper meal before every shift. He got sober for a year and then fell apart and then got sober again and then fell apart again. He went to AA meetings in church basements in 3 different states. He accumulated years and regrets in equal measure. He thought about the children every day. This is the thing that is hardest to explain, hardest to sit with, hardest to understand. Because when you hear a story about a father who walked out on 3 children under the age of 9, the natural and entirely reasonable assumption is that he did not think about them, that the leaving was evidence of an absence of love. But Raymond thought about them every day. He thought about Callie's stubbornness and her mother's eyes. He thought about Marcus opening the refrigerator by himself, that small triumph. He thought about Ellie, tiny Ellie, who had been 3 years old when he left, who would now be a grown woman he would not recognize on the street. He thought about them and he did not call. He thought about them and he did not write. He thought about them and he stayed away, and the cruelest, most honest part of his explanation, the part he would eventually have to say out loud to 3 people who had every right never to speak to him again, was that he had convinced himself they were better without him. That a man who could not stop drinking, who had already done damage, who came from a line of damaged men, was a threat to his own children. That leaving was, in its twisted, cowardly logic, an act of protection. And maybe, if Raymond had been a different kind of man, one with access to the kind of help and perspective that might have straightened that logic out, that story might have ended differently. Maybe he would have gotten help sooner. Maybe he would have come back when the children were still young enough that the wound could have healed without the scar that 20 years of absence carves into a person. But Raymond was not that kind of man. Not yet. In 2003, Raymond Harmon was living in a small apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. He was 45 years old. He was sober, genuinely sober, the kind that had held for 3 years and felt different from all the times before it, felt structural rather than temporary. He had found a sponsor through Alcoholics Anonymous named Gerald, a 70-year-old retired electrician who had no patience for self-pity and an enormous capacity for honesty, and Gerald had spent those 3 years methodically dismantling every justification Raymond had ever constructed for his own behavior with the precision of a man who had heard every version of every excuse and was not impressed by any of them. Gerald told Raymond something in a church basement in Phoenix that Raymond would repeat for the rest of his life. He said, "Raymond, there is a difference between the reason something happened and the permission those reasons give you to keep letting it happen. Your father was a drunk. That is a reason. It is not a permission. You walked out on your children. That is a fact. The question is not whether you had reasons. The question is what you are going to do with the years you have left." Raymond sat with that for a long time. He had been sitting with a lot of things for a long time. The question of what to do came up against what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, which was that Raymond did not know if his children wanted anything to do with him. Callie would be 20 years old now. Marcus would be 18. Ellie would be 15. They had grown up entirely without him. They had made lives without him. He had forfeited any right to walk back into those lives and expect anything at all from them. He knew this. Gerald had made sure he knew this. And knowing it, understanding it down to his bones, was part of what made picking up the phone so hard. Because calling was not something he could frame as being for them. Calling would be for him, and he had done enough damage by making choices that were for him. So Raymond did not call in 2003. He did not call in 2004 or 2005 or 2006. What he did was write letters. 12 of them over 3 years, addressed to Diane's house in Clarksville, Tennessee, because it was the only address he had. He did not know if Diane still lived there. He did not know if she had moved on, remarried, taken the children somewhere else entirely. He wrote the letters and he mailed them, and he had no way of knowing whether any of them arrived or what happened to them when they did. Diane received every single one of them. She did not tell the children. She read each letter in her car in the school parking lot, sitting alone with the engine off, reading and then sitting for a long time afterward before she went inside. She did not tell the children because Callie was 20 and in college and had finally reached a place of equilibrium that Diane had worried for years she might never find. Because Marcus was in the army and the last thing he needed was to have Raymond Harmon reappear in his mind and destabilize something that had taken enormous effort to stabilize. Because Ellie was 15, and 15 was a hard enough age without adding this particular complication to it. Diane kept the letters in a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet, under a winter sweater, behind some old photo albums. She told herself she was protecting her children. She told herself she was waiting for the right time. She told herself Raymond had no right to them and that the letters were therefore her decision to make, her burden to carry, her call. She also told herself, in the quiet of the nights when she could not sleep, that she was not entirely sure she believed that last part. The right time, as Diane feared it might, kept refusing to arrive. The years moved. Callie graduated college and became an occupational therapist and got married to a man named David who was steady and kind and who loved her in the uncomplicated way that Callie had never experienced from a man in her family. Marcus came back from 2 tours overseas, quieter than he had left, with a stillness in him that might have been peace or might have been exhaustion and was probably both. He moved back to Tennessee, got his contractor's license, built a small business, and spent years rebuilding the relationship with his mother and sisters that the army had, in its strange way, given him the perspective to want. Ellie became an emergency room nurse in Nashville and worked overnight shifts and developed the particular kind of calm that emergency rooms give to people who are not destroyed by them. Diane retired from teaching in 2015. She was 55 years old and had been teaching in the same school for 28 years, and at her retirement party, the principal said she had taught over 700 students and that roughly half of them had come back at some point to tell her she was the reason they loved to read. Diane cried at that. She cried the honest way, not the polished way, the way that surprises you when it arrives. She went home from the retirement party and sat in her kitchen and looked around at the house that had held all of them, all those years, and she thought about Raymond. She went to her closet and she took down the shoebox. There were 22 letters in it by then. Raymond had kept writing, one or two a year, sometimes more. The letters had changed over time. The early ones were apologetic in a way that still had some self-justification woven into the apology, the kind of sorry that is also still explaining. The later ones were different. Quieter. More honest. In one from 2013, Raymond had written something that Diane had read 4 times, sitting in her car in the parking lot of a CVS on a Wednesday afternoon. He had written that he understood if none of them ever wanted to speak to him. He had written that he was not writing to ask for anything. He had written that he was writing because there were things he needed them to know, because he was 55 years old and he was aware with great clarity that the years remaining to him were fewer than the years behind him, and he did not want to leave this earth without his children knowing that the leaving had been his failure, entirely his failure, without condition or qualification, and that not a day of his life had passed without the weight of it. Diane sat in her kitchen with the shoebox on the table in front of her. She thought about 700 children who had learned to love reading. She thought about the 3 children who were hers, who were grown now and who had built lives that were genuinely good and genuinely hard-won, and she thought about whether those lives included room for this, for Raymond, for the truth of the letters in the box. She picked up the phone and called Callie. Callie did not speak for a very long time after Diane finished talking. What Diane heard on the other end of the line was breathing. Just breathing, slow and measured, the way Callie had learned to breathe when she needed to hold herself together. Then Callie said, "How many letters?" Diane said, 22. Another silence. Callie said, "Mom, that was our decision to make." Diane said, "I know." Callie said, "You should have told us." Diane said, "I know, Callie. I know." What followed was not simple. Nothing about this story is simple, and if you were expecting simple, this is the moment to let go of that expectation. Callie called Marcus that night. Marcus did not take it as quietly as Callie had. Marcus had a vocabulary for his anger that he had spent a long time cultivating, and he used a significant portion of it on the phone with his sister. He was not angry only at Raymond. He was angry at the layers. At the fact that there had been letters, that there had been contact, that a door had existed that he had not known about, that the shoebox had been sitting on a shelf in his mother's closet while he had spent 30 years believing that Raymond Harmon had simply gone silent and stayed silent and felt nothing. Ellie was the one who surprised them. Ellie, the quiet one, the one who watched and said little, called Callie the next morning and said, simply, "I want to read them. All of them." Marcus wanted nothing to do with any of it. For 6 months, Marcus was very clear that he was not interested in Raymond Harmon's letters or Raymond Harmon's apologies or Raymond Harmon's anything. He said this to Callie and he said it to Ellie and he said it, with considerable restraint, to his mother. He had built his life without a father. He had made his peace with that, or something close enough to peace that he was not willing to blow it up on the chance that Raymond had managed to become someone different in 20 years in Arizona. Callie read all 22 letters over the course of a weekend in November. She sat in her living room with David reading in the next room, and she read from the beginning, in order, and she let herself feel everything that came up as she read, which was her therapist's advice and also the hardest thing she had done in a very long time. The early letters made her furious in a way that was old and familiar, anger she had thought was behind her that turned out to have just been waiting. The later letters did something else to her, something she was not entirely prepared for. They did not make her forgive Raymond. Forgiveness was not something that could be delivered by a letter in a shoebox, regardless of how honest the letter was. But they made her see Raymond as a person, a full, damaged, accountable person, rather than just an absence. And that was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. Ellie called Raymond. This is the detail that still astonishes people when they hear this story, that it was Ellie, the youngest, the one who had no real memory of him at all, who made the first phone call. Ellie found the return address on the most recent letter, which was a P.O. box in Phoenix, Arizona, and she wrote a letter of her own that was 4 sentences long. She wrote, "My name is Eleanor Harmon. I am your daughter. I don't know what I want from this. I thought you should know I read your letters. She mailed it and then she went to work a double shift in the emergency room and did not tell anyone what she had done. Raymond received that letter on a Thursday. His sponsor Gerald had died the year before, at 78, and Raymond had placed a single white carnation on his grave at the cemetery in Phoenix because Gerald had once mentioned offhandedly that his mother used to keep a pot of white carnations on the kitchen windowsill and that they were the flower he associated with being safe. Raymond had no one to call when he read Ellie's letter. He sat in his apartment for several hours and thought about a baby who had slept with her fists balled up like she was ready to fight the world, and he understood that she had apparently been ready to fight the world, that she had grown into a woman who could hold the hardest things steady and not flinch, and that she had gotten that from her mother and she had gotten it from herself and she had gotten it from the 30 years of practice that his leaving had given her. He wrote back within the week. He wrote 4 pages. He asked her nothing. He told her everything she had asked him in her letter about the years, about the drinking, about getting sober, about Gerald, about the letters. He told her that he had thought about her every single day. He told her that he knew that was not enough and that he was not saying it because he wanted credit for it. He told her that she did not owe him anything. He told her that he was 60 years old and that he was, for the first time in his adult life, a man he did not entirely hate, and that the thing he was most grateful for was that the Harmon children had a mother who had held everything together while he fell apart, and he was sorry for every moment of every year that holding had been necessary. Ellie wrote back. And then Raymond wrote back. And then, slowly, with the particular caution of people handling something they are afraid to drop, a correspondence began between a 60-year-old man in Phoenix, Arizona, and a 33-year-old emergency room nurse in Nashville, Tennessee, who was his daughter and who was figuring out, one letter at a time, what that meant to her. Callie found out about the letters 6 months after they started. She found out because Ellie told her, and because Ellie had decided she was done keeping things in boxes. Callie wanted to be angry. She had some material for it. But she looked at her sister and thought about a woman who had grown up with no memory of her father and had decided, on her own terms, with no one's permission, to reach into that absence and see what was there. And she found that the anger did not quite take. Callie asked Ellie if she could read the letters. Ellie said yes. Callie read them. Then she read Raymond's letters to her mother again. Then she did something she had not entirely planned. She told David she was going to go for a drive and she drove to the empty parking lot of the elementary school she had attended as a child in Clarksville, Tennessee, and she sat there in the dark with the engine running and she let herself cry in the way she had not let herself cry in years. Not the controlled cry, not the held-together cry. The deep one. The one that comes from the place where a 6-year-old girl learned to listen for the sound of boots on porch steps and gauge what the night was going to be. When she was done, she wiped her face and drove home. She did not call Raymond. Not yet. Marcus was a harder road, and it would be dishonest to this story and to Marcus to pretend otherwise. Marcus had built something solid and he was fiercely protective of it. He had a contracting business and a small house outside Nashville and a girlfriend named Lisa who knew everything about his history and who had the patience and the steadiness that Marcus needed without ever making him feel managed. He was not a man who dealt in half measures or easy reconciliations. When Marcus decided something, he decided it all the way. What moved Marcus was not something any of them expected. It was Gerald. Callie had mentioned Gerald in passing, the sponsor, the 70-year-old retired electrician, the man who had spent years telling Raymond the truth when Raymond needed it most. She mentioned Gerald because Gerald had died the year before Ellie's first letter, and Raymond had written about him in a way that made the loss feel real, made Raymond feel real. Marcus had heard this and filed it away in the category of things he was not going to think about yet. He thought about it in February of 2020, when Marcus's own best friend from the army, a man named Carl who had been his bunkmate during both deployments and who was the person Marcus trusted more than almost anyone on earth, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Carl was 41 years old. He had 2 kids of his own, a daughter and a son, and he had made Marcus their godfather 4 years earlier at a backyard barbecue in Georgia while the kids ran through a sprinkler and nobody was thinking about anything heavy. Carl died in August of 2020. Marcus took the loss hard in the way that Marcus took everything hard, which was mostly on the inside, which was mostly in the places other people could not see. He was at Carl's funeral and he looked at Carl's kids, 9 and 7 years old, and he thought about something he had never allowed himself to think, which was that Carl's kids would carry this for the rest of their lives and they would carry it in the way that Marcus had carried something, and that carrying it did not mean you were destroyed by it but it also did not mean it was light. He went home from Carl's funeral and he called Ellie. He said, "Tell me about the letters." Ellie told him. There was a long silence. Marcus said, "Does he know about Carl?" Ellie said, "No." Marcus said, "I want him to know about Carl." Ellie said she would tell him. Raymond wrote Marcus a letter after Ellie told him about Carl. He did not try to leverage Carl's death into reconciliation. He did not frame it as a moment of connection or a reason Marcus should let him back in. He wrote about grief in the way that a man who has lost many years writes about grief, which is to say, plainly, without decoration. He wrote that he was sorry about Carl. He wrote that he understood what it meant to lose someone who had held you together through something you could not have survived alone. He wrote nothing about himself in that letter. It was, from beginning to end, about Marcus, and about Carl, and about the particular loss of the person who has seen you at your worst and stayed. Marcus read that letter 3 times. He told Lisa about it that night. Lisa listened without saying anything for a long time, and then she said, "What do you want, Marcus? Not what does he deserve. Not what your sisters think. What do you want?" Marcus thought about that for a very long time. He said, "I want to stop carrying this by myself." The first phone call between Raymond Harmon and his son Marcus happened on a Sunday morning in October of 2020. Marcus was 35 years old. Raymond was 62. It had been 29 years since Raymond had driven away from Clarksville, Tennessee, in a truck with a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the kitchen table behind him. The call lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. Neither of them could have told you exactly what was said during those 4 hours. What Marcus could tell you was that he had gone into that call with a specific list of things he needed Raymond to understand, things he had been carrying for 29 years, and that he said every single one of them, out loud, without softening them, and that Raymond received every single one of them without making excuses. What Raymond could tell you was that listening to his son speak was the most important 4 hours of his life and that at some point he stopped being able to speak at all and simply listened, and that this was the right thing to do, and that he wished he had learned how to do it 30 years earlier when it might have mattered differently. At the end of the call, Marcus said something that Raymond would carry for the rest of his life. Marcus said, "I'm not going to tell you we're okay. Because we're not okay. But I'm going to tell you that I called, and that means I think we might be able to be something. I don't know what yet." Raymond said, "That's enough for me." It was not, of course, the end of anything. This is the part where stories that want to be tidy will often wrap up with a reunion scene, with tears and embraces and the music swelling, with the impression that love found its way home and everything that was broken was mended. But real families do not work that way, and if this story has done anything, it has tried to be honest with you, from the beginning. What happened next was slow. What happened next was that Callie had her own phone call with Raymond, in December of 2020, and that it lasted an hour and a half and that it ended with Callie saying, very quietly, "I have a daughter. Her name is Sophie. She's 3 years old. She loves dinosaurs." Raymond said, "That sounds about right for a Harmon." And Callie laughed for the first time in a call with her father. The laugh surprised her so much that she cried immediately after it, and Raymond said nothing, just waited, which was the right thing to do. What happened next was that Ellie told Raymond she wanted to meet in person when the pandemic allowed it, and that she wanted to meet on neutral ground, somewhere that belonged to neither of them, somewhere they could leave if they needed to. Raymond said of course, wherever she wanted, whenever she was ready. What happened next was that Diane sent Raymond a text message, the first contact she had made directly since he left in 1991. The text message said, "The kids are remarkable. I want you to know that. Whatever happened between us, they are remarkable people and they became that way on their own. Raymond did not know what to say in response to that. He sat with it for 3 days. Then he typed back, "I know. I've been watching from the letters. You did that, Diane. That was all you." Diane read the message in her kitchen, the same kitchen she had stood in all those years ago, and she set her phone face down on the table and stared at the ceiling for a while. She did not respond to that message. But she saved it. In the summer of 2021, on a Thursday afternoon in July, Raymond Harmon drove from Phoenix, Arizona, to Nashville, Tennessee, a drive of 21 hours that he made over 2 days, stopping overnight in Amarillo, Texas, sleeping 6 hours in a motel off the highway, and arriving in Nashville in the late afternoon when the light was doing what summer light does in Tennessee, turning everything golden and heavy and beautiful. He met Ellie first. This had been the plan, agreed to by all 3 of them, that Ellie would go first because Ellie had started this, because Ellie had written the 4-sentence letter that changed everything, and because all 3 of them understood, in the unspoken way of people who have known each other their whole lives, that Ellie was the one who could hold this first. They met at a coffee shop near the hospital where Ellie worked. Raymond was sitting at a table by the window when Ellie walked in. He had arrived 20 minutes early because he could not make himself be late for this. He was 63 years old and his hair was gray and his face was the face of a man who had lived a hard life and come through it. He recognized Ellie immediately, which he had not been entirely sure he would, because the last image he carried of her was a 3-year-old with her fists balled up, and the woman who walked through the door was 34 and wore scrubs and moved through the world with the particular directness of someone who had spent years in emergency rooms and learned that there was not always time to hesitate. She stopped when she saw him. Just for a moment. Then she walked to the table and sat down across from him. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Ellie said, "You look like Marcus." Raymond laughed, surprised. He said, "Marcus looks like his grandfather." Ellie said, "Don't tell Marcus that." And just like that, in the ridiculous, ordinary, entirely human way that impossible things sometimes happen, 2 people who had been strangers to each other for 31 years found something to smile about across a table in a coffee shop in Nashville, Tennessee. They talked for 3 hours. Ellie had a list of questions, actual questions, written in her phone's notes app, and she worked through them with the same systematic care she brought to a patient assessment, and Raymond answered every one. She asked him about the drinking. She asked him about the years in between. She asked him about the moment he decided to start writing the letters. She asked him, directly and without softening it, why it had taken him 12 years to write the first one. Raymond answered that question the way he had answered it to Gerald and to himself and to the walls of his apartment in Phoenix across many years of sobriety. He said he had not believed they wanted to hear from him, and that he had used that belief to protect himself from having to try, and that it had taken him 12 years to become honest enough with himself to understand that. Ellie looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most honest thing I have ever heard a person say about a cowardly thing they did." Raymond said, "Gerald used to say something similar." Ellie said, "I would have liked Gerald." Raymond said, "He would have loved you. He had a weakness for people who tell the truth." Callie came 2 weeks later, with David, without Sophie, because she was not ready to introduce Sophie to Raymond and was not sure when she would be, and she had decided that being honest about that was more important than performing a readiness she did not feel. Raymond understood this. He said so. He met David and shook his hand, and David, who was a quiet, observant man, looked at Raymond with the particular look of a person who has heard a great deal about someone and is now taking stock of the reality against the story, and seemed to find it neither better nor worse than expected, which was probably the best possible outcome. Callie and Raymond talked for 4 hours at Diane's kitchen table, which is where Callie had wanted to do it, in the kitchen that had held all of this, in the house that had been the ground under all of their feet while Raymond was gone. Diane made coffee and then took herself to the backyard because she understood that this was not hers to witness. She sat in the garden she had tended for 30 years and listened to the sound of her daughter's voice through the screen door, not the words, just the sound, the rise and fall of it, and understood from the sound that it was going to be all right, that all right was not the same as healed, that healed was not the same as fixed, but that all right was real and it was enough. Marcus waited until September. He did not meet Raymond in Nashville. He asked Raymond to come to his house, which was a deliberate choice, a way of meeting on Marcus's ground, in Marcus's life, in the thing Marcus had built without Raymond's help or presence. Raymond understood this. He came on a Saturday morning. Marcus's truck was in the driveway. The house was small and well-built, the yard immaculate, the kind of house built by someone who takes pride in making things solid and permanent. Marcus opened the door before Raymond knocked. They stood in the doorway for a moment, a 63-year-old man and his 35-year-old son, looking at each other across the years. Marcus was taller than Raymond by 2 inches. He had Raymond's jaw and Diane's eyes and a set to his shoulders that he had gotten from neither of them but from himself, from everything he had carried and built and survived. Raymond said, "You turned out better than you had any right to, given where you came from." Marcus said, "I had good help." Raymond said, "Your mother." Marcus said, "And other people. Come inside." Raymond came inside. They sat at Marcus's kitchen table and Lisa brought coffee and then left them to it, because Lisa understood what this was. Marcus had put a photograph on the table before Raymond arrived. It was a photograph of the 3 of them as children, Callie and Marcus and baby Ellie, taken in the backyard of the Clarksville house in 1990, 1 year before Raymond left. Callie was grinning with a gap in her front teeth. Marcus was squinting into the sun with the expression of a child who has decided he will not smile for this photograph and is holding to that decision with great seriousness. Ellie was in Diane's arms at the edge of the frame, just visible, just there, her fists characteristically balled. Raymond looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up at Marcus and said, "I have this same picture. I've had it with me for 30 years. Marcus looked at him. He said, "I know. Ellie told me." They talked for 6 hours. At some point they stopped sitting at the table and moved to the porch, and Lisa brought more coffee and sat with them for a while, and Raymond told a story about Pat, the diner owner in Texas who had made him eat a proper meal before every shift, and Marcus laughed at the story in the way that Marcus laughed, the whole body laugh that he had gotten from Raymond and had never known it. And Lisa looked at Marcus when he laughed and then looked at Raymond and did not say anything, but the look said everything. Before Raymond left, Marcus walked him to his car. They stood in the driveway. The late September afternoon was doing what September afternoons do in Tennessee, cooling the air just enough to remind you that summer will not last forever. Marcus said, "I'm not going to pretend this fixes things." Raymond said, "I know." Marcus said, "But I'm also not going to pretend it doesn't matter that you're here." Raymond said, "That's everything to me." Marcus said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you." Raymond drove back to his motel and sat in the parking lot for a long time before he could go inside. It was 6 months later, at Christmas of 2021, that all of them were in the same room together for the first time. Diane had asked if Raymond could come, had asked her children, had said she would understand completely if any of them said no. None of them said no. It was not a decision that came easily to any of them. It was a decision that came from the same place all the hard decisions in this family had always come from the understanding that family is not the thing you are given, it is the thing you choose to keep choosing, even when choosing it is costly, even when it asks you to hold more than you thought you could hold. Raymond drove from Phoenix. He arrived on Christmas Eve, as planned. He stood at the door of Diane's house in Clarksville, Tennessee, the house he had walked out of 30 years before with a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the table and a wedding ring on the bathroom counter, and he knocked on the door. Callie opened it. She had Sophie on her hip, 3-year-old Sophie who loved dinosaurs, who looked up at Raymond with enormous uncomplicated eyes. Callie said, "This is Sophie." "Sophie, this is Raymond. He's family." Sophie regarded Raymond for a moment with the total seriousness of a 3-year-old conducting an assessment. Then she said, "Do you know about stegosauruses?" Raymond said, "I'm going to need you to teach me." Sophie said, "Okay, come in." And Raymond Harmon walked back into the Harmon family on the authority of a 3-year-old who loved dinosaurs, and nobody laughed and everybody did, and Diane was in the kitchen and she heard it through the doorway and she held onto the counter for a moment, quietly, and then she went back to stirring the gravy. This is not a story about forgiveness being easy. It is not a story about damage undone. Damage does not get undone. 30 years of growing up without a father does not get given back. The anxiety that Callie carried through her teens, the anger that Marcus turned outward before he learned what to do with it, the particular loneliness of Ellie's hunger for something she had never held, none of that is erased by a phone call or a letter or a man standing at a door on Christmas Eve. This is not that kind of story, and it would insult every one of them to pretend it was. What this is a story about is something harder and more durable than that. It is about the fact that Callie Harmon, at 38 years old, sits in her therapist's office and talks about her father in the present tense. It is about the fact that Marcus calls Raymond on the first Sunday of every month, calls him the way you call a person you are still figuring out how to love but have decided to keep figuring it out. It is about the fact that Ellie, who has seen more loss in the emergency room than most people see in a lifetime, says that the most important thing she has learned about the human body is also the most important thing she has learned about the human family, which is that it is capable of healing in ways that seem, before they happen, impossible. It is about the fact that Raymond Harmon is 70 years old now and sober and living in Clarksville, Tennessee, which he moved to 3 years ago, to be within driving distance, to be present in whatever way is wanted and welcome. He goes to an AA meeting on Thursday nights at a church on the edge of town. He has a vegetable garden that he manages with considerably more success than he managed the one in 1988, which Callie finds unreasonably funny and does not let him forget. He has a granddaughter named Sophie who calls him by his first name because that is what felt right to Callie, who is the one who gets to decide, and who has found over time that Raymond does not need a title to be something real. He has a son who calls him on the first Sunday of every month. He has 2 daughters who have made room for him in lives that were already full and complete and did not need him, which is the most generous thing they could have done and which he understands is not owed to him and which he is grateful for every single day. He has Diane, not in the way he had her before, not in any romantic sense. That ship sailed in 1991 and neither of them has any interest in the kind of story that pretends it did not. But Diane and Raymond have what might be described as a complicated piece. They have dinner with the family on holidays. They talk on the phone sometimes, briefly, about the children, about Sophie. Diane has told Raymond things, over the years, that she needed him to know, and Raymond has listened, and sometimes the listening takes everything he has, and he does it anyway, because Gerald told him once that the most important skill a person can learn is to receive the truth they have earned. Diane kept the photograph. The wedding picture, the 2 of them young and laughing in the parking lot of the church, Raymond's arm around her waist, both of them looking at each other rather than the camera. She moved it from the kitchen to the hall closet some years back, and then eventually to a box in the attic, but she kept it. When Sophie was 4, she found it while helping Grandma Diane look for Christmas ornaments and asked who the people were. Diane told her it was Raymond and his wife, from a long time ago. Sophie looked at the picture for a moment. Then she said, "Raymond looks happy." Diane said, "He did, some of the time." Sophie said, "Is he happy now?" And Diane thought about that, genuinely thought about it, the way she thought about everything that mattered, slowly and honestly. Then she said, "I think he's working on it. I think that counts." Sophie handed the picture back, satisfied. Then she went back to looking for Christmas ornaments. Outside, through the window, the oak trees that had been growing on that street since before the Civil War were doing what oak trees do, quietly, steadily, with no drama at all, just growing. Just holding. Some families fall apart and stay apart. Some families fall apart and come back together as something different, something that is not what they were and cannot be and should not pretend to be, but something that is its own thing, its own particular shape. The Harmons are the second kind. They are broken and they are beautiful and they are, in every way that matters, still here. That is the story. Not the story of how a family was saved. The story of how a family, slowly and imperfectly and on its own hard terms, chose not to be done.